I can build you the coolest robot possible, but if I don't understand how I'm going to get that robot into the homes of older adults, that robot's just going to sit in the lab.
Did you know that AgeWell just launched an AgeTech showroom in downtown Toronto? In this week's episode of the AgeTech Podcast, I sat down with Alex Mihalidis, the founding Scientific Director of AgeWell, to talk about some of the key takeaways from running Canada's Aging and Innovation Network for the past 15 years. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Keren. Thanks so much for having me this morning.
So you, as the founding Scientific Director of AgeWell, you've been there from day one. Can you give us a little bit of the origin story of AgeWell, where it started and where it's at today?
Sure. So, the origin probably started almost 15 years ago when, I was having a meeting on a completely different related topic with some of the more well-established researchers in the area of aging and technology and artificial intelligence. And, during that call, they said, this field is starting to grow in Canada, but it really needs some kind of backbone. It needs some kind of organization that can bring everyone together. And during that conversation, someone said, and by the way, the federal government has this program called the Networks of Centers of Excellence, which is meant to bring together the best and brightest in a specific area to really help have Canada lead, globally in that particular field. And, there's been these networks of anything from, studying the ocean and water quality to space and astronomy and finance and commerce. And, so I thought that was a good idea. And I said, sure, absolutely. Let me know any way I can help to get this application together. And that's when there was kind of this pause. And, I knew what was coming. It was, we want you to lead it. And, 15 years ago, I was still relatively junior faculty member. And so I was a bit hesitant, but, they talked me into it. And that's when, I brought Bridget on board, Bridget Murphy, who was my COO and managing director, now the acting CEO of AgeWell. And we put the application together, and it was a long process, but it was a fantastic process because, we really saw how the whole age tech field in Canada really rallied behind this application. And so we were successful after about a year and a half application process where we did appear before panels with our federal government, et cetera. And then when we got it, we were all ecstatic. And, really that's how it came about. And it's just been growing and getting better every day over the past 15 years now. So it's been a real pleasure to have been able to start it and to lead it for all this time.
That's wonderful. And you just returned from a year in Spain. And so you have, for over the past 15 years, and also having been to Europe for a full year now, you have those sort of a global perspective. Do you think that Canada's government is more forward-thinking than other governments in terms of really supporting the AgeTech ecosystem?
So the answer actually is no. We were funded 15 years ago among many other networks across different areas. And, we are funded, one, because the topic is important, but two, also we put together an extremely strong application. Unfortunately, the government stopped the funding about a year ago to this program just out of the blue, and has not really been supportive moving forward, except with some smaller grants and, to really help us to continue to move AgeWell forward. Now, the main reason I say, though, I don't find them as supportive as other governments is, they do not have funding programs specifically, for aging, or they talk a lot about the development of standards and the development of technology for use in long-term care, for example. But again, there's no money behind these things. And so, this is one thing that AgeWell really has been trying hard to do, is really to talk with our policymakers, really try to push the agenda with our federal governments, our provincial governments, our territorial governments, even at the municipality level, to really be putting more resource into, technology solutions, but also just in terms of changing the overall care system for our older adults and their caregivers in general. So, when I was in Europe, I got to experience, what Spain is doing and some other countries, and the Horizon Europe funding program, which is the largest funding program in the world. And they have a whole specific call around aging and disability. So I would say, Canada, still is falling behind the rest of the world in terms of the support that we do for this particular work.
That is super interesting and I guess somewhat counterintuitive when you look at just how many startups are coming out of Canada each and every year. It's one of the largest ecosystems we have in AgeTech.
Yeah.
So speaking of startups, you've been throughout the years supporting the startup ecosystem through various programs. And the most recent thing that you launched was the AgeTech Innovation Studio. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was in partnership and through the generosity of the University of Toronto and specifically the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering there. They have provided new space for AgeWell as we move into our new phase of life, post-federal government funding. And, we needed really two things in this new space. One, we needed easy to access workspace for our startups and for our students and for our researchers. But the second thing we wanted to have was a demonstration of apartment, essentially, where, we don't want people to go in there doing basic research. We already have a home lab at one of our partner hospitals, Toronto Rehab, where basic research is being done. But we wanted a space where things could be showcased. We wanted a space that is easily accessible by the public. So by older adults, caregivers, companies, funders, whoever really is interested in seeing, what is brand new in terms of AgeTech. And so that's what we have. We're right downtown. We're not on the university campus. We're right kind of in the heart of it all, easily accessible by transit and walkable so people can come see it. We have IKEA, for example. IKEA Canada came in and furnished the whole apartment. So, so it actually looks like a real livable space. It's not one of those places that has a fake ceiling or a fake floor, whatever. It's a real apartment. And so we're really excited to be able to use this to offer to our startups and our partners and to whoever else wants to use it to demonstrate some of the great innovations that they've been working on.
That is awesome. So you have on one hand startups showcasing their products, and on the one hand you have people from the industry, from the aging industry, coming to see what's out there. Is it like, do you have office hours? How does that work actually?
Yeah, so what we'll be starting to do soon is setting up monthly times when people come in and do public tours. And so we'll be advertising this widely across our network and with our partners and then to other local, community ways of getting the news out. And so we want to set up a specific time every month so that people know that this is when it's happening. And our hope is that every month we have something brand new in there that people can see so that even if you've seen it once, it's not like you don't have to come back and see it again. At the same time, though, we also then, we'll take private requests from people that wish to bring in a group or, a specific tour or something like that. So that's all being set up right now through our office, and we'll make sure that, you know exactly the details so you can share with your listenership as well in terms of how they can come in and check things out. Amazingly, we actually have people internationally coming. We have a company from Singapore right now in Toronto that is there to see the innovation studio and to maybe try to recreate that space back in Singapore as well. So that's been a nice outcome as well.
That is fantastic. And what is the process like for startups? Do they apply to become part of the innovation studio? And how do you choose when you have so many startups wanting to showcase their solutions?
That's a great question. So we have a wonderful person in charge of the startup program and business development, Michael Czerkowski. And so he works very closely with the startups. And it's not like a formal application process. I think it's really just, working with them to see what stage they're at. Is this something that they can go ahead and put, in the innovation studio itself? And more importantly, what are they ready to show to the public? And have they gone through that stage of protecting their intellectual property, et cetera? So that's something that, Michael works out with everyone on a case-by-case basis.
Interesting. I really can't wait to see what startups are showcased, and I'm sure that it will be very well received by the public and by the industry, as it sounds like it already is.
Yeah, so far we had our opening reception a couple months ago, and we had about 140 people come to the reception, and constant tours going through the space, and everyone was just commenting on Great West. So we're very happy with what we've done so far.
That's amazing. And you already have multiple other avenues of working with startups and facilitating these cross-sector collaborations. Can you elaborate on some of those, maybe some that are open to applications right now?
Yeah, so we are always been funding research and startup companies in some way. We don't have any open calls right now as we continue to transition to the new phase of AgeWell and our funding. However, one of the principles we've always held in anything that we funded is that it must be, multidisciplinary. It must not just focus on the technology development itself, but in fact, it needs to really focus on three things. So the technology, the service delivery model, and the practice and the policy aspects of it, because those are the three things you really need to have figured out in order to get something out there into the marketplace, into the hands of older adults, right? I can build you the coolest robot possible, but if I don't understand how I'm going to get that robot into the homes of older adults, if I don't understand the regulatory aspects of whether it's Health Canada or the FDA or the equivalent around the world, then again, that robot's just going to sit in the lab. And so that's a model that we insist on, and we put throughout all the programming within AgeWell, even with our trainee program, where we fund PhD students and postdocs.
So I find it fascinating that you also work with academics to sort of help bring academic research and commercialize it and sort of help it become a product that reaches people, consumers. Can you think of examples off the top of your head of specific technologies that emerged like this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been several examples of that. So, one of our early on successes was Braze mobility. And this is where sensors that turn our wheelchair into a smart wheelchair. And that started by one of our postdoctoral fellows that we funded. And so working with her and helping her move things forward, we helped her to establish Braze mobility, and that company is doing well and has sales and continuing to move on. And the founder, Pooja Viswanathan, actually has now returned to academia as a professor and still running the company. So, she returned to academia just because, again, she wanted to re-engage in the research side of AgeTech as well, now that she's had her stint of more than 10 years of work on the business side. So, that's a good example there. We have a company called Nightingale.ai that is doing home-based sensing, and that is being developed by a former PhD student along with a professor in the Faculty of Nursing right now at the University of Toronto, Charlene Chu. So again, that is taking their academic work and moving it towards a startup. So, it's been fascinating to see how interested a lot of faculty members are in developing startups. It's been even more wonderful to see how many of our trainees are interested in going on to do their startups. And I would say a lot of our startup companies are in fact coming out of trainees work. They're finishing their PhDs, they're perhaps realizing they don't want to be an academic in the true sense. And so they're moving things forward with their research into commercial products. So, I like to think a lot of that is because of the support that AgeWell has provided, not just cash support, but all the training we provide, the support from Michael, who I mentioned earlier, and other mentors that we have in place within the network. So, just one quick example, we have a chief entrepreneur for the AgeWell network, and that's somebody named Michael Tamlin. Well, Michael Tamlin's history is he invented the Kobo e-reader, which is, the main rival with the Kindle, and he's still the president CEO of Rakuten Kobo right now. So, he is an entrepreneur at heart, and he dedicates and volunteers so much of his time to help our students and our faculty members to move things forward. So with mentorships like that, people are really gaining invaluable experience.
That is wonderful. Do you have any advice for people in academia who have research, who have ideas, and that they want to commercialize, but they're not sure if entrepreneurship is for them, because it is taking a huge career risk to leave your position in academia and to start a startup, and you never know if it's going to succeed or not.
Yeah, that's a great question, Keren. I am one of those academics who do not want to be an entrepreneur, just because of the things that you said. But the end of the day, if they want to really take that chance and take that leap, they need to make sure they have something that people actually want. And that's, one of the biggest mistakes that we always see, that people move forward with a product without doing the right amount of consultation, without discussing things with their potential clientele, just to make sure they got it right. And, that's what AgeWell is here to do. We can provide that connection. We have a community of over 5,000 older adults and caregivers, across Canada that are all interested in providing that type of input. And so we, really try to get involved as early as we can to help, a professor or student to formulate what their idea is and to make sure it actually is hitting the mark before they take that leap and move things forward.
Is there a specific methodology that you've developed throughout the years to going through this process? Because I think it is a crucial step that sometimes people forget.
Yeah, I don't know if we came up with a specific methodology as opposed to drawing upon well-known ways of going through the entrepreneurship program. And we make sure that we have all of our people take a very holistic approach, again, looking not just at the technology, but the service delivery and the policy and practice. We make sure that they are talking with older people and caregivers or whoever they're developing technology for very early and often, not just as an afterthought or, or tokenism, that, they truly are part of the team in some way. And then we really do push the whole mantra of entrepreneurship of, fail fast and fail often if you need to. Don't be afraid just to get some ideas out there in front of people to take a look. And again, that's what we're hoping the Innovation Studio will also help people to do is to get something out there, put it in front of people, have people come play around with it and see what needs to be changed moving forward.
Will it be possible for the founders or product developers to be in the studio when people are using their products to sort of see how it goes?
Yeah, no, absolutely. They can be there. Sometimes, though, it's better if they're not there because obviously we don't want them to bias the client. So, we can have students or people from our team, collect this information on their behalf. So it all kind of depends on the situation.
So throughout the past 15 years, what have you seen change in the AgeTech ecosystem? I mean, obviously we have many more startups today, but do you also get a sense that consumers and organizations in aging are more open to adopting these technologies? Like you said, people are signing up to come to the Innovation Studio?
Yeah, I think the biggest change is, age tech is cool now. People and students want to get involved in projects, and these are students who, for example, have backgrounds and degrees in computer science or theoretical mathematics and things like that. They want to apply their skills to age tech, which, when I started off 25 years ago, that wasn't really the situation. The interest in the academic world in age tech has significantly grown. I remember giving my first presentation at a conference probably about 24 years ago. And it was on, using smart home systems to support older adults with dementia. And the first question I got asked is, why are you doing this? Like, what's the point? Right? Like, they're going to end up in a home, they're going to end up with a caregiver. And now, we have many conferences just on age tech, which is fantastic to see. Yes, and people want to adopt these technologies. They want to use them. They want to buy them. They want them available. But I think we still need some work on how to do that, right? And some of these technologies are still very expensive. So how do we drive those costs down? Funding for these types of technologies is still not readily available through some typical programs that would cover most of the costs of your quote unquote, classic assistive technologies. And so there's still a lot of work to be done by all of us in this field, I think, around the world to continue to open up those pathways and avenues so that people can actually now get these things in their hands and their homes.
Absolutely. And I think driving the costs down is possibly one of the top 5 things that need to happen for widespread adoption, because a lot of the devices, I mean, especially devices, if there's hardware involved, they can cost hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of dollars per unit.
Exactly.
So for most consumers, it's not viable.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, when you meet these young students that are coming from computer science and mathematics and don't have a background in aging, and they're suddenly realizing that age tech is cool and that it is a big market. If they want to start a company, they should definitely look into it. Are there any specific challenge areas that you refer them to?
No, I try to keep it, personally, when students come to me, I try to keep it as open as possible at first. And, the first thing I like to understand is what is their personal experience with aging? Because everyone has, a grandparent, an older parent, or someone in their lives that they have a story from. And so I try to understand, what those stories are, what their personal interests are, and then really try to go from there. And once I've identified that, then I try to open them up a little bit to talking to more older adults. I've had a practice for a long time as well that, sometimes I'll have my students when they first start volunteer in a long-term care home or in a nursing facility, just so they understand the daily problems that, caregivers and the care staff there and older adults themselves face. And so I really want them to absorb as much as possible and build upon their personal story, which, is a very small sample size, obviously, to understand what these issues are. From there, then, we really try to narrow things down in terms of, what their project's going to be. And again, trying to solve one thing and solve that one thing that's a real world problem. And, it's a problem sometimes, but it's also fantastic that students come and, they're excited about the area. They want to try to solve everything. They want to apply all their skill sets as much as possible. And that said, I love seeing that enthusiasm, but it's also then working with them to, try to understand, what are you solving? What does your person need from what you're developing?
That is awesome. And volunteering in a long-term care setting definitely, I think, is an experience that will stick with people, because it's very different reading about the challenges of aging, and it's then seeing it with your own eyes and
Mhm.
seeing just how, the people who work in this industry are dedicated, but also stretched very, very thin, and how much technology is needed in these spaces. So
Yeah, exactly.
it's amazing. And the last thing that you launched, I just saw you announce it on your LinkedIn just a couple of weeks ago, was the AgeTech Futures Institute. So first of all, congratulations. And can you tell us a little bit more about that one?
Yeah. So, this is something that myself and colleagues around the world have been thinking about for a long, long time, developing an independent think tank for this area, not to replicate or replace existing networks that are out there like AgeWell and others, but to really complement. And so finally, when I, quote unquote, retired from being scientific director of AgeWell and became the founding scientific director of AgeWell, I took this as an opportunity to finally move this initiative forward. And so I reached out to, you know, some of the top 10 to 12, individuals and colleagues that I've worked with in some capacity around the world. I explained to them what the idea was. And the main idea here is a true independent think tank. So the initial group of fellows that I want to bring on would not be there representing their organization, not representing their institution, not representing any specific government, but themselves as leaders and experts in the area of age tech, so that we can get around a table, as often as possible, talk about the issues that are currently happening in age tech that we're seeing, that our partners are telling us about, and then for us to be able to have some kind of influence. And that influence may be through policy documents, white papers, workshops that will hold presentations, or just simple dissemination through, media forums like your podcast. And again, to really make it a safe place for all of us to speak our minds in terms of what needs to be done in this particular area. And maybe use a bit of a Canadian analogy where it snows a lot here, of just plowing the road for those, that are up and coming, right? To make things easier than it was for us 20 years ago. And so, the details are still being worked out. The first in-person meeting of the group of 10 fellows will be at the International Society of Gerontechnology Conference in March in Vancouver, 2026. And so expect out of there some new outcomes and some new ideas coming out of this group. So stay tuned.
I will stay tuned. It sounds like a wonderful and much needed initiative. And yeah, we should definitely have another conversation in future episode about the key takeaways from bringing together all these brilliant minds.
Absolutely. That'd be wonderful.
So that was actually my last question. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you would like to add? Any call to action to our audience?
Yeah. I think the main call to action is, continue to make AgeTech cool, right? And it's something that is needed. And, there's so much evidence out there now by all of the work that's being done around the world on the impact that technology can have on the lives of older adults and their caregivers. And, so let's continue to push the policymakers. Let's continue to push the companies that are out there to take on these types of projects, and let's make AgeTech, mainstream. Let's make it as simple as going to, your local electronic shop and buying, the latest and greatest gadget out there. And if we continue to do that and push as a community, all work together, I hope within, 3 to 5 years from now, we're going to see robots readily available and at costs that are accessible by as many people as possible.
Hear, hear. I'm sure we'll get there. And I have no doubt in my mind. Yeah, hopefully within 3 to 5 years. I'm ready for this future. By 2030, affordable home buster robots for everyone.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining me on the show today and for all the work that you do to not only push AgeTech forward, but like you said, make AgeTech cool.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Keren.
Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode, you might want to check out my conversation with Sabrina Boutin from Envisage, another important initiative supporting Canadian AgeTech innovation. I'll put the link right here. Until next time, stay humble, stay curious,